Hey everybody, how you guys all doing? I wanted to do a shout out this morning. I feel so disconnected from everybody. Wondering how you guys are doing and what's going on, but just to try to connect a little bit. A shout out to my students. I'm going to start with my Monday, Wednesday History 101 class. Nayeli, Ariana, Taylor, Ashmead, Parmeet, Colin, Joshua, Kaylin, Jamie, Alyssa, Dylan, Madison, Nellie, Justin, Sky, Emily, Javier, David, Priscilla, Noah, Jacob, Christina, Nicholas, Natalie, James, Christian, Madeline, Luis, Mario, Kennedy, Zachary, Nathan, Josh, Stephen, Melissa, Brianna, Shochi, or Shochil. I looked that up to try to figure out how you're supposed to say that. Juan, Martin, Janet, Cecilia, Aaron, the whole group. I hope everything is okay with y'all and you're hanging in there. I don't know about you, but kind of living this life looking for distractions in some ways from sort of the essential reality that's going on around here. It's weird just being home all the time. And I've been cooking bread. I think everybody's cooking bread. The only problem is we're having a hard time finding flour anymore. But I've made dinner rolls. I made cinnamon rolls. They're pretty darn good. Anyway, I kind of hope that maybe this class, these videos, be a little bit of distraction for you guys too. Just to spend some time to get through these weird days, this weird time that we're all involved. But I truly hope that everyone is well and safe. Okay, so sometimes in history, the events are so incredible that you can tell almost the very moment when something's beginning here. Okay, so I can tell you something big began to happen at about 11 p.m. on the night of April the 18th, 1775. And what's about to begin, of course, in that particular moment is something called the American Revolution. What had happened was that Boston had been just shut down by the British. This was part of the punishments, part of the coercive acts. Boston was shut down. And the people of New England, people of Massachusetts kind of were beginning to prepare themselves for potential conflict. As I told you, they were organizing themselves into Minutemen groups. They were gathering weapons together at places like Concord, and then, the British were aware of this. Just this extraordinarily kind of volatile situation. Well, the British knew that the Americans had begun to gather together weapons at places like Concord. In fact, they had found out about Concord. So on the night of April the 18th at 11 p.m., the British decided they were going to do something about it. Their notion was to be proactive. So they decided to send 700 soldiers out in the middle of the night, not the hour, it's 11 p.m. There was a curfew in Boston. The curfew was about 10 o'clock. So they'd wait till after the curfew when everyone's supposed to be, of course, in their houses, and then they would try to secretly, of course, advanced their way out from Boston to this town that was about 15 miles away called Concord. Now, I drew a map here just to give you kind of sense. I hope that you guys can see this okay. This kind of gives us a little bit of understanding there. It's very much abstracted from their essential reality. Boston was out kind of on this interesting sort of amoeba-like peninsula. Most of the areas that were settled is the shaded-in area over here, of course. There were parts of it that were not terribly settled. One thing about Boston, when you go there, you find out that Boston is a city that is made on fill. They filled in all these surrounding areas, essentially. This used to be called the Fens down here, and the Fens is like a word for the swamp. And right around here somewhere is Fenway Park, and where the Boston Red Sox will play. Anyway, this is the Charles River going out into the harbor area, of course. This is the city itself. The wars were over here. In fact, the Tea Party would have been down over here someplace. Anyway, they assembled the 700 soldiers over here in an area that wasn't a settled area. And the idea was to cross the Charles River and then to march these soldiers out through the night to sneak up on the arsenal, of course, to take it and to quell any potential activities that would occur. Now, the British were, of course, trying to do this in secret, but the reality was that the Americans had all become spies. They were all paying attention as much as they possibly could to what the British were doing. So as soon as the British assembled themselves at 11 p.m. and then began to cross the Charles River, and they're going to do these in rowboats provided by the British Navy. British Navy is kind of all around here too, trying to make sure that no one can get in. And the British, this is called the Boston Neck, and the British were controlling the Boston Neck too, so there was no way to get in or out of Boston unless the British would allow you to go. But as soon as the British began to move, the Americans were aware of this. And one of the people who was very much aware of this was a man by the name of Paul Revere. Paul Revere, of course, becomes very famous in this particular moment. He was a silversmith, and the silversmiths were like at the top of the scale of the craftsmen, right below the goldsmiths, essentially. He was a son of liberty, so he'd been part of these proto-revolutionary bodies that had formed all the way back since the Stamp Act. And for whatever reason, he really, really despised the British. He has a kind of a keener anti-British feeling than I think your average American would have, at least. Anyway, Paul Revere had arranged for, first of all, there to be a signal system that would begin to let everyone know what was happening on that particular night. So I'm sure you guys have heard of the story. This X right here represents where the old this old North Church, excuse me, it's the northern part, old North Church. It had the tallest belfry tower in the northern part of Boston. And so there was a signal system that was created to come out of that church, and it was, I'm sure you guys have heard it before in the poem, 1 if by land and 2 if by sea. So at 11:01, just shows you how quickly the Americans were on this. 2 lanterns are coming up in this belfry tower, 2 lights are coming to shine out, to radiate, of course, the information that the British are on the move. Now, 2 if by sea, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. There were 2 ways the British could go. They could go by land, they could march out the neck. So if they had done that, that would have been 1 lantern. Or if they go by water. And that could mean that they loaded onto ships. If they went onto ships, then of course the Americans would want to know that they were on ships. But in this case, just in boats, of course, to cross them over. 700 British soldiers crossing over. I want you to know that it's a really miserable day as far as the British are concerned. They cross them over. It's chilly. April is still pretty cold in terms of Massachusetts. They cross them over. They dump them into a swamp. So these guys are all getting out into this, murky, damp area. Their boots were wet, and of course, then they're going to be required to march some 15 miles out the roads on their way to Concord. As they go, it became immediately clear that the Americans were aware of the situation. They could hear church bells in the distance. They could hear gunshots in the distance, because the Americans were watching every single move that the British would take and being ready to act upon that. Paul Revere, of course, becomes the most famous in terms of this particular moment. He's not alone in what he did, but as the British are leaving over here, he gets himself in a rowboat and he's going to cross over, across the Charles River. He had prearranged for there to be a horse, and apparently this is the most famous horse or something like that in Massachusetts, and a strong, enduring animal. And then Paul Revere takes off through the night. He's going to go on his midnight ride, the midnight ride of Paul Revere. William Dawes and others did the same thing. Paul Revere, simply maybe because of the poetic nature of his name, I don't know, is the one that we kind of will remember. He would go through the night, and I have to tell you, I've always wondered about, the dynamics of riding a horse down darkened roads in the middle of the night. I hope that the horse could see better than the human being, but all I could think of was that if you're riding a horse in the middle of the night and you can't see very well, keep your head below where the horse's head is, because if there's a branch or something like that, that's gonna hurt, to say the least. Anyway, Paul Revere would take off, of course, and wherever he would go, he would stop to warn the people. And if I was in class, I'd say, would he say to them, of course? And students would often say something like, the British are coming, the British are coming. This is kind of the image that we have of what Paul Revere would say. But I want you to know that that's not what he said, because that would have been confusing. Everyone who lived in the colonies was technically British, so if you said that, what are you trying to even convey? So of course what he said when he came was, the soldiers are coming, the Redcoats. Everyone knew what that meant. That meant that the British Army was on the move, and that meant that you had to be ready for it. What happens because of Paul Revere and all the others who will do the same kind of thing, is this remarkable kind of system of warning that will begin to reach out. So everywhere Paul Revere stops, he's going to go on, of course, and then maybe 2 or 3 others are going to go on. And everywhere they stop, 2 or 3 others. So you have this spider web effect of the expansion of the information associated with the Redcoats being on the move. So it is said that the news of the Redcoats movement traveled about 25 miles in 24 hours. So it travels out to the entire, radiates out to the, I think it's even, can't remember sorry. But it will mobilize, here's my number, it will mobilize 25,000 militiamen, 25,000 Minutemen were mobilized once they heard, of course, that the British were on the move. So that meant 700 British soldiers marching out there with a potential of 25,000 Americans grabbing their guns and beginning to respond to the situation. Now, what that means is, of course, the alarm is going much faster than the soldiers. The soldiers are plotting their way, of course, out along the road. It's a fairly substantial group of 700 soldiers. It is believed that the word of the soldiers moving got to Lexington about 1 o'clock in the morning. And that meant that the Minutemen were mobilized at 1 o'clock in the morning. The soldiers are not even there yet. In fact, the soldiers aren't going to get there until 6 o'clock in the morning. And indeed, many of the Minutemen who rallied to Lexington, they're sitting there waiting, and some of them even went home because they thought it was a no-go. By the time we get 2 o'clock in the morning, the word gets to Concord, and as soon as it got to Concord, then the objective was to just scatter the arsenal. So the objective of the British soldiers is taken away almost from the very beginning moment, of course, you know, and they're marching just out, of course, with nothing that they actually will be able to do. Anyway, they arrived at Lexington about 6 a.m. in the morning. And Lexington has a green, the famous Lexington green. And the green is like a soccer pitch. It's just a big kind of open area and a little bit of a slant on the soccer pitch. And the British came in from the bottom. The road comes in from the bottom and it comes to the Lexington green. And out about the midway point, so the 50-yard line as far as this area was concerned, there were 90 Minutemen that were just standing there, of course, with their weaponry. And the British advance group comes in to the green. They were led by a guy named Major John Pitcairn. He was a Royal Marine, dressed, of course, in his red finery with his saber and everything. And as he comes into the green, he sees the Americans arrayed against him. So, and of course, there's 700 soldiers behind him, but you know, only a small group can come up the road at a time. And Pitcairn, of course, is pissed because he knows that, you know, the surprise, the gig is basically up. So as he sees these Americans, he pulls his saber and he kind of holds it and waves it at them. And he says, "Ye villains, ye rebels, disperse, damn you." You know, he's telling them to get the hell out of there, okay? And as he's saying this, of course, more soldiers are coming and kind of beginning to line up. The Americans, you got to picture them in kind of a long line with their muskets, and you picture then the British beginning to assemble, you know, whatever, 30, 40 yards away from them. Anyway, what happens next is intriguing. You know, there's the so-called mysterious shot that's going to occur at Lexington. And, you know, from observers, it didn't come from the American side and it didn't come from the British side. There's just a shot, you know, it makes you think, you know, could there have been someone else somewhere outside of the shooting? You know, my ridiculous mind wants me to think that there was like some young boy who got up early that morning to go hunt rabbits, you know, and he sees a rabbit and he shoots at it, and all of a sudden all hell breaks loose. I mean, I can't tell you that's the case. But there's a shot, and then, of course, there's a response to that shot. And the British open fire upon the Americans, and 9 Americans will die there. And of course, the rest of the Americans simply just run for it. You know, what are they going to do in the face of 700 British regulars? So the first deaths will occur at Lexington on the morning of April the 19th. You know, it's the first shots, of course, and the first deaths. The British then continue their march on the way to Concord. And they arrive at Concord, and to come into Concord, you have to cross a bridge. There's a bridge there. And of course, it's a very famous historical site that a lot of tourists, I was there. When you go there, they're routinely, like, there's someone dressed in you know, British reenactor or something like that, or an American Revolutionary soldier that was there. When they get to Concord, the Americans knew that there had already been shots fired, and they knew that someone had already died. So as the British are crossing the bridge, the Americans open fire on them first, and they will kill 3 British soldiers. So that by the time we get to Concord that morning, both the Americans and the British have casualties at that particular point. Now, of course, the Minutemen just simply have to run after that because they're facing this very substantial contingent of 700 soldiers, and the British can invest the town. Of course, they search for the arsenal, and they search in vain. The arsenal is gone. The object, of course, of their mission has basically been taken away from them. And then they do that thing that you really shouldn't do in this situation. They just sit there, kind of indecisive, you know, not really knowing what to do next. And so, you know, instead of, it would have been smart to pretty much turn around and head back to Boston, the relative safety of Boston, but instead they kind of wait around a little bit. As they're waiting, the Minutemen are rallying, and the Minutemen will begin to descend towards this area, and just anywhere along the road. They knew exactly where the British had to go to get back. So you have Minutemen just kind of coming, ready, preparing themselves. In some cases, actually, forming into kind of battalions. There's a couple little pitched battle situations in this retreat. But finally, the British decide they've got to go back. You know, the mission has been foiled. So they will come back, and as they come back, they are faced with about 1,100 Minutemen. So not all 25,000 that were mobilized during that period will arrive there. In fact, just a small minority of them will come in. But 11,000 Minutemen just sort of waiting for them. And routinely, you know, behind the trees, behind the rocks, Massachusetts is famous for the rock walls. It's a stony soil, and the farmers would just have to take the stones out of the soil if they're going to farm their field, and they'd put them into walls that would line the roadways or line the field areas. And it was a perfect, of course, place for the Americans to hide. And so as the British are marching back, increasingly they're just being sniped at and hit by these ambushes that are all along the way. And whenever they would like try to run into the woods to get them, then they find themselves in deeper difficulty. So pretty soon it became just this pell-mell effort on the part of the British soldiers to make their way back to Boston. And in the end, they begin to discard their packs because they want to go faster. And in the very end, some of the soldiers discard their weapons because it's hard to carry the musket and run as fast as you possibly can. Anyway, it's a really, really bad day for the British. 700 soldiers will leave that morning, and over 200 of them will not return. I don't have my cash flow list right here, do I? I do not. Anyway, but you know, a significant amount, I think it was 280. About 280 of these British soldiers will not return, either killed, wounded, or captured, basically, as a result of this. So, a very bad day. And of course, in American history, these are simply known as the first shots. I want you to know that at that time, you know, or somewhat later in this area, they would call them the shots heard round the world. And of course, you know, you and I know that they were the shots that were heard practically around the area of Lexington and Concord. But they were the first shots that would become the American Revolution. There's no doubt about that. With the events of Lexington and Concord, the revolutionary momentum begins to occur in a very significant kind of way. Now, one thing that's interesting about this moment is, while the people of Massachusetts and New England basically perceived that they were at war, as far as they're concerned, it's war. I mean, they're shooting and stuff like that. Most of the colonists didn't quite see it that way. Most of the colonists had not lived in the volatility of what had been Massachusetts, you know. There hadn't been as much activity. There hadn't been the interactions, of course, with the British and the British soldiers. And you wouldn't have seen that in South Carolina or Georgia or even New Jersey or Pennsylvania, different places, in New York. So many of the other colonies had never really seen the intensity kind of the conflict that had been brewing as far as New England was concerned. So in the moment of Lexington and Concord, there was not a majoritarian notion of going to war. I mean, that's not what's happening at that particular moment. In fact, most of the Americans, although horrified by the events, that's true, were more thinking, okay, you know, the British we're gonna protest, the British are gonna back down. It's gonna be the way it had been before, you know, on numerous occasions, essentially. But events would conspire to make it not have that kind of outcome, you know. And there's two things that I want to highlight for you that really happened in the aftermath of Lexington and Concord. The first is the way that the British behaved relative to the situation. So the British actions that followed Lexington and Concord. The British by this time were just overwhelmingly pissed off about everything. From their point of view, they had done nothing wrong in any particular kind of way. Yes, they tried to tax the Americans a little, but then they repealed the taxation. The administrative activities were minimal as far as they were concerned. They tried to provide them better, cheaper tea. And so when the British hear about Lexington and Concord, I mean, they can't believe it. You know, their notion is, damn these Americans, you know. And from their point of view, this was not a time to negotiate and back down. This was a time to go hard and punish the Americans. So that's exactly what they're going to do. And among the things that the British will do at this time, you know, and this is the kind of thing that's really going to infuriate more and more Americans, they hired Hessian mercenaries. So this is its own little weird story. The Hessians are Germans. And these mercenaries, I don't know the story exactly. There must have been a monarch in Hesse-Darmstadt, or this is one of the kingdoms or small area principalities of Germany at that time, who was willing to sell his soldiers, you know, I guess, or to sell them to the highest bidder. They were interesting individuals. They tended to be kind of, you know, physical specimens. They tended to be relatively tall. They wore black uniforms. I'm sure that makes them a little more fearsome. At that time, they wore these super high hats that just went up, you know, pointed up towards the sky. So when they would march, they would look like, you know, some really substantial people. But the British hired these Hessian mercenaries to come over to deal with the American situation. And I don't know about you, but if you hired mercenaries to deal with me, I'm going to feel, you know, kind of offended by that situation. So this was something the British did that really began to piss off the Americans. Another thing they did that infuriated the Americans was that they offered alliances with the Native Americans. Now the Indians actually felt very much more akin to the British. The British, through the proclamation line, had tried to protect their area. That seemed like a good thing to them. The Americans were more aggressive, and they were the local problem, basically. So if the British were willing to work with the Native Americans were willing to work with them, as they had with the French sometime before. So the British are offering sort of, you know, to the Indians, if you side with us, things will go well for you. Well, you can imagine how any American would feel if the British were, promoting any kind of Indian action against the Americans themselves. So this was infuriating, of course, and began to push more and more Americans kind of to the idea that maybe it is time for serious conflict. Another thing that the British did, which is just sort of amazing, and in many ways it seems like it just doesn't make sense, from the point of view of what outcome you're looking for. This was in the South, and in the South, the commander in the South offered to free the slaves if they would come to the British side. So any slave that would support the British side in terms of this conflict would be offered freedom. And as you can imagine, a whole bunch of slaves took them up on this, so they would run away from their masters and they would go to the British. And ultimately it became just kind of a fiasco. The British then had all of these people, and they did help the British effort to some degree, but they had to take care of. And as the war, of course, turns against the British, that became even more problematic. And first they took a lot of these freed slaves up to Nova Scotia, and they lived there in a segregated situation that was pretty miserable. That's up there by Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's not necessarily the kindest environmental area. And then finally, the British will actually repatriate them to Africa, and they will be the foundation of the settlement of Sierra Leone. And there's stories about that too, how horrible that was. That these Africans, these African Americans, really, who went to Africa for the very first time and just kind of, had to really confront the tropical dynamics of that, which was something that they were not used to at all. So it's a story unto itself. But here's the point I'm trying to make, if you offer to free the slaves, there's a whole bunch of white Southerners who are going to be extremely unhappy with you. And the activities, and by the way, the guy who did this was Lord Dunmore down in South Carolina. Those people who lived in the South, those people who owned slaves, of course, they increasingly began to see, that maybe there was a need to kind of go against the British in a more serious sort of way. Finally, in just, kind of an emotionally catalyst situation, there was the bombing of this town called Portland. Now, technically at that time it was part of Massachusetts, but for us it ultimately became part of Maine. And so the British Navy went by this American town that was on the coast, and they bombed it. They just bombed it. And of course you could think that that's just a horrific kind of activity, but really it was retribution. The Americans had destroyed a British revenue cutter. They had burned it to the waterline, the classic statement, of course, of damaging a ship. You all know that the ship could only burn to the point where the wood is in the water, and then you can't burn it any further, of course. But the British were simply retaliating against what they saw as an offense against themselves. But still, from the American point of view, and if you were far enough away from it, you just could think, oh my God, they're bombing us or something like that. So one more thing that began to push the Americans. So the British activities and the expressed hostility they had towards the Americans was clearly, something that began to push more and more Americans to the side that maybe independence, maybe war is the way to go. The other big thing that happened was a document that appeared in America that had a tremendous impact. It's interesting that Americans would respond so keenly to the written word, but this is something that's going to have a huge impact. And I'm not going to tell you about the document to start this. I'm going to tell you instead about the author. And the person who wrote this was a man by the name of Thomas Paine, and Thomas Paine becomes a potential identification for the second midterm. So I hope we get some information on Thomas Paine here. Thomas Paine's a tremendously interesting person with this kind of global life where, the impact is not just in America, but all over the place ultimately, but it just becomes just fascinating in his own particular way. Now, one thing I really want you to know about Thomas Paine to start is that he's not an American. He was an Englishman, there's no doubt about that. Lived most of his life up until this moment in England. And he's kind of an interesting Englishman. You can describe him as a ne'er-do-well, so that's a person who struggled in their life in a number of different ways. He tried to be a corset maker. That didn't work very well. He tried to be was the head of a school. That didn't work out very well. He tries a number of different things, and it seems to fail. So in the year 1744, he runs away. I think it's the best way to say it. He runs away from England. He abandons his business activity, the debts that he had. He abandoned his wife and children. I must admit there have been times I thought about that too. No. I see that a lot. Anyway, he abandoned his wife and children, and he runs over to the colonies. He's coming to the colonies basically to escape a life that is not going very well for him. Anyway, the thing that's interesting is that when he gets to the colonies, he finds his vocation. He finds what it is that he can do. And the best way that I can describe it is he becomes a professional revolutionary. That's really what he was. He will live his life through revolutionary activities. He starts in the American Revolution. He's critical in a number of ways in the American Revolution. When that's over, he goes to France. He becomes part of the French Revolution, even getting himself thrown in the Bastille. He gets himself threatened with getting beheaded, you know, all those kind of activities. He later then would go to South America and become part of the South American revolutionary activities. I mean, it's kind of an amazing career of a professional revolutionary. I do want you to know that this doesn't make you a lot of money or necessarily a lot of friends. He did actually die a pauper, so that meant he had no kind of support for himself. He would be ultimately buried in a pauper's grave in Philadelphia. So that's a grave where they would take all the poor people, and my vision of that is like a mass grave where you're just putting the bodies of these indigents in there. At some point there was a decision made that this wasn't right, that this was a very prominent historical figure, should not be in some mass grave. So they disinterred the body and they put it in a much more distinguished grave. I haven't seen what that looks like or anything like that, but I have a feeling, you know, bigger headstone, all that kind of stuff. My wonder is, you know, how did they know which one is which? You get down in a mass grave, so maybe it doesn't matter. Of course, it's more the monument that becomes the big deal. But anyway, Thomas Paine comes to America and he finds his calling, and his calling is to be basically a professional revolutionary. Well, he's checking out the scene in America. He's only there for really 2 years. And he's realizing that things, of course, are in an interesting situation, and he really thinks that the thing that Americans should do is begin to move on their own. So he writes this very, very famous document, and the document is called Common Sense. And it's a hard one to describe exactly. It's not so big that you really want to call it a book. I think it's about 80, we could call it a book, though. I think it's fine to call it a book. You know, it's a little bit too big to be called a pamphlet. It's maybe a little small to be called a book. But the title of it was Common Sense, and this would be published in January of 1776. And this will have a tremendous impact, of course, on America, which I will hide for you in just a second here, okay? Now, the first thing I want you to know about Common Sense is the extraordinary popularity of the document. The initial printing was something like 80,000 copies, and they sold out immediately. And I want you guys to know that there was no intent to gain profit off of this. The price of the pamphlet was basically just to pay the printing costs, okay? But ultimately, they will publish over 500,000 copies. 500,000 copies. The only book that was published more than Common Sense in colonial America was the Bible. That's the only one. We got a dog on the loose outside. What's going on with that? Anyway, the only book that was published more was the Bible. So this is just extraordinarily popular. There were 2.5 million people in America at that time, I think I told you guys. So that meant that there was one copy of Common Sense for every 5 people. And to me, that means that probably every American had heard or read or had Common Sense in their possession. It was read from the pulpits, it was read in saloons and taverns, it was read by people who just, in the state houses, it was read, of course, by individuals. I mean, Common Sense was read by everyone. Everyone in America read Common Sense, and because of that, Common Sense will have a tremendous impact upon the American people at this time. So, you know, when you have a document, the critical issue is, what does it say? You know, what's the big deal here? So let me just tell you some of the things that were stated in Common Sense. The major part of Common Sense is simply in support of representative government. And so a lot of it is not that terribly exciting for those of us that would try to read it now. It just simply sees the importance of representative government. This is the best thing, of course, that protects liberty. This is the best thing to suppress power, of course, especially the corruptive components of power. So, you know, he simply really kind of says how much we should celebrate representative forms of government. Of course, in writing this, he's just speaking to the choir. The Americans are absolutely convinced that this is the best form of government. But much of what he's saying in the document is simply his support of representative government. Of course, the Americans could absolutely identify with this. But here's the more kind of important things that he says, the things that have the impact. And here's the first one. One thing that he does in Common Sense absolutely is he attacks the king. Now, I can't tell you everything, of course, in our class, but here's one thing that I probably should have let you know a little bit more. When all of the protests and conflicts were going on in the 1760s and 1770s, the Americans tended to overwhelmingly blame Parliament. They saw Parliament as the bad guys, and whoever the Prime Minister was, you know, Lord North or whoever it might have been at that time. And they, for whatever reason, they thought that the king was not a bad guy. The king is on their side, essentially. So Parliament's doing all these really bad stuff. All these bad things, and of course the king, he's okay. And you know, as late as 1775, you would hear Americans drinking to the health of King George. You know, so now what Thomas Paine does was he comes over and he says, "Look, everybody, you know, I'm an Englishman, so I know what's going on here. And so, yeah, you attack the Parliament, that's correct, but the king is also part of the problem. It's the king and Parliament that rules, essentially. So the king is as much at fault for all of your troubles as Parliament is. And indeed, he will say in his famous line there, the king is a royal brute. The king is someone who's really causing you a tremendous amount of trouble. Now, what is argued in terms of what's happening when Thomas Paine attacks the king is that he was cutting the last umbilical attachment between the Americans and the British. So if Parliament's not on our side and the king isn't on our side, well, then nobody's on our side, all right? And so all of a sudden, more and more Americans are feeling like they're on their own, and they're going to have to go there in their own particular kind of way. I do want you to know that there's a huge physical impact of what Thomas Paine says here in Common Sense. All over the colonies, there were statues to the monarchy. That's a thing that you do, of course, when you live in this kind of situation. You have statues of the king. So there were busts of the king, there were equestrian statues of the king, they're all over the colonies. And so all over the colonies, and this is a powerful symbol of regime change, the Americans will begin to tear those statues down. That's what they did in the Soviet Union, after the fall of the Soviet Union. That's what they did in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein. That's what you do. You tear down the symbols of the old regime. And so they would take, ropes and they would put them around the neck of an equestrian statue and they'd attach it to oxen, and the oxen would just pull it. And then as the statue came crashing down, of course, all the Americans are making their big applause. So anyway, this is what happens. As soon as he attacked the king, of course, more and more Americans are turning very much against the British in a very serious way. But the most important thing he says, it's just inherent in the title of the book, it is common sense that you seek your independence now. Now, if he worked for the Nike Corporation, he would have said, just do it. This is your chance, essentially. In one of his more beautiful little statements there, and he could turn a phrase, there's no doubt. He said, in a world of tyranny and abuse, you have the opportunity to start the world again, Can you imagine, in any kind of critical moment of being able to start it all again and do it in a better way? And that's what he was trying to present to the American people. So I hope that you see, it's pretty clear what's happening here. The significance of Thomas Paine is that he began to inspire more and more Americans, and common sense would then lead directly to the Declaration of Independence. This is an absolute direct connection and causal relationship. The British do their bad stuff. Thomas Paine puts common sense out there, and almost immediately the Americans are going to begin to move towards independence. And this is going to take them ultimately, in my outline, of course, I forgot to say, I always hope you guys have the outline with you. You can print it off from Canvas and just have it at your side. It's always a good idea also to have your study sheet at your side, of course, for any potential identifications. But, I'm going to call this little section To the Declaration, that movement from common sense that will take us within a matter of months, to the Declaration of Independence. So here's what happened. The first thing happened was that the individual colonies declared their independence. That's the first thing that's happening here. So I don't know which one was first, but that means Delaware and Virginia and Massachusetts and all of them will ultimately issue resolutions of dissolution. So that means that they are resolving to dissolve the relationship they have with Great Britain. So one thing that's interesting about that means the first actual independent entities, it's not the nation, it's the individual colonies, which now went from being the colonies to the state, or they could call themselves the Commonwealth, or they could call themselves the states. Ultimately, we're going to consider them all the states, okay? So the very first thing that happens is that the states are going to declare their independence. Now, by this time, the states had sent representatives to a unified body, and that unified body that was emerging is called the Continental Congress. So there is a Congress that is functioning in America as we're heading into the early part of 1776. In some ways in the very beginning, just to try to create a concerted effort and protest, increasingly, of course, to become a sovereign entity that will govern over the United States of America. Now, in that body, in this deliberative body of the Continental Congress, on June the 7th, 1776, so the states have all become independent by that moment, there is a move in Congress, and it was Richard Henry Lee of the Lee family of Virginia, of course, one of his descendants would be Robert E. Lee, stood up in front of Congress, and he called for a resolution of dissolution. So now a united statement, and I think all the Americans realize that they can't go it on their own. They've got to be united in this major activity because, of course, they're taking on a huge challenge in trying to deal with Great Britain. So Richard Henry Lee stands up and calls for a resolution of dissolution, and what they did is they voted for that. Okay, so what you're doing is you're voting simply that there should be created a document that will allow you to dissolve the relationship. what happened that day was that they would then vote for a committee to create the document. So you have to create the document itself. The committee was composed of 5 individuals. Forgive me for not always remembering every single one of them. I think Roger Sherman was one of them. I know that John Adams was one. I know that Benjamin Franklin was part of the committee. But the most important member of the committee was from Virginia, and that person's name was Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson is critically important in this moment because he basically was given the task of writing out this resolution of dissolution. So, that's what the committee did. They gave, here, Tom, go write us something. And I always try to imagine what that was like. I think he had like 2 weeks or something that he's working on this thing, And, I don't know if it just flowed out of him or something like that. Part of my image, I picture him, he's writing, and of course right next to him, the desk is a whole bunch of crumpled pieces of paper or something. I mean, you guys know, but in those days they would have been writing with quills, of course, dip into the ink. It's a feather situation. My cat, Gus, is right in front of me. Anyway, so he's writing this, of course, and I hope he struggled, I'd hate to think that he was just able to pull this thing out of the hat or something like that. But so he puts this together. He then brings the document that he has to the committee, and that means, biting me. All right, stop. Oh, okay. It's really happening. It's right there. So here, why don't you get out of here, okay? You're bugging me. This is Gus. He is a big fat cat. What can I say? Go bug somebody else, okay? Anyway, the committee will work together. There's a lot of editing that is done by, suggestions by John Adams, by Benjamin Franklin. Not everything that Thomas Jefferson did was going to be sanguine as far as many people were concerned, so they are going to change some of these things. But the committee will put together, of course, this document, and they will present it to Congress on July the 2nd, 1776. And this was for significant discussion. One thing that's interesting, in the Library of Congress, we have this initial handwritten document. So this is what Jefferson brought to the Congress. And you can look at this and you can see like the scratching out and the replacement of words and things like that. There were a number of things that were not, Congress wasn't happy about in terms of the document. One thing that Jefferson did was he kind of attacked the king, the parliament, and the British people. And all the people in Congress said, we don't want to attack the British people. We want to have them on our side. We want them sympathetic to us, So they would erase that part. Another thing that Jefferson did, which is just intriguing, because he's the slave owner. He's constantly ragging on the evils of slavery, and so he puts a part in the document that sort of blames the king for slavery. And of course, the people in the South said, what the hell, slavery is something that we need, it's something that's valuable to us, so, and we're not going to go along with that. So they're going to go, through this, of course, and they're going to revise it in a variety of ways. They finally, at the end of the day, they have the revisions they want, and so they will vote on July the 2nd. That's the actual voting date, of course, and with 11 states approving and 2 abstaining, and that was New York and Pennsylvania. And they basically just said that they needed to go back to their state legislature to achieve approval, which of course was pretty much guaranteed at that particular moment. Continental Congress will pass on this particular document. And I'm sure you guys know, of course, what that's going to become. I do want you to know that, it's interesting to me that they actually passed the document on July the 2nd. So the question becomes, why do we celebrate on July the 4th? Well, the reason we celebrate July the 4th is because that's the ceremonial moment, okay? What they had in hand on July the 2nd was just a piece of paper that had a whole bunch of scratch outs, where they had made all their amendments, essentially. They would then send the document to the scrivener, and the scrivener was a professional writer and would write out this entire thing in his beautiful hand. You guys all know that I could have been one of these guys. I have that same kind of tremendous writing ability. But they bring then that beautiful copy back, of course, on parchment, and that will be the one that they will sign. So July the 4th is the actual signing ceremony, with John Hancock making his really big dramatic signature, basically, to be followed by 54 others, the representatives from every single state putting their name on it also, case. And what they had done is created for the nation something called the Declaration of Independence. And I'm going to take a stop right here because I forgot my copy of the Declaration of Independence, but I'll be right back, all right?